Right now, as you're watching this video, bombs are falling, families are running, and two groups of people who have been fighting over the same piece of land for over 3,000 years are still at war. But here's what most people don't understand. This conflict didn't start in 2023. It didn't start in 1948. And it didn't start with any modern politician. This fight goes back to the very beginning of recorded civilization. And unless you understand the full story from the very first chapter, you will never truly understand why this war never ends. Today we're going to break down the entire history of the Israel-Palestine conflict from the very beginning. And by the end of this video, you'll understand this conflict better than 99% of the people arguing about it online. This is the story they don't teach you in school, the story both sides don't want you to hear, and the story the world desperately needs to understand. But before we dive in, if you're new here, welcome to Simply History. We break down the most complex events in human history and make them simple to understand. If you enjoy this video, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And do me a quick favor right now. Drop a comment below telling us what country you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We love seeing how far this community reaches across the world. Now let's get into it. To understand this conflict, you need to forget everything you think you know. Forget the news, forget the arguments on social media, forget the politicians. We're going back to the very beginning, to a time before Israel existed, before Palestine existed, before any of the modern borders were drawn. We're going to a tiny strip of land on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea. A piece of land so small you could drive across it in about 2 hours. And yet this tiny piece of earth has caused more bloodshed, more wars, more tears, and more arguments than almost any other place in human history. Historians call it the most contested land on earth. And once you understand why, you'll see that this was never just about two groups of people fighting. This was about something much deeper. Now you're probably thinking, what's so special about this land? Why has everyone been fighting over it for thousands of years? Here's the answer. This land sits at the exact crossroads of three continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. Every major empire in history that wanted to control trade, military routes, or religious power had to control this land. The Egyptians wanted it, the Assyrians wanted it, the Babylonians wanted it, the Persians wanted it, the Greeks wanted it, the Romans wanted it, the Crusaders wanted it, the Ottomans wanted it, and the British wanted it. But more importantly than geography, this land became the spiritual center of three of the largest religions in human history: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And that is where the real problem begins. Let's start with the Jewish people, because their connection to this land goes back the furthest. According to both the Bible and historical records, around 1800 BC, a man named Abraham made a covenant with God. God told Abraham that this land, the land of Canaan, would belong to his descendants forever. This is what Jews call the Promised Land. And this single promise has shaped the next 3,800 years of history. Abraham's grandson Jacob, who was later renamed Israel, had 12 sons, and those 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. These tribes settled in the land of Canaan, and over the centuries, built a civilization there. But here's where it gets interesting. Around 1000 BC, a king named David united the 12 tribes and established Jerusalem as the capital. His son Solomon built the first temple, a massive sacred structure on top of a hill in Jerusalem, known as the Temple Mount. This temple became the holiest site in Judaism, the physical house of God on earth. And this is not just a religious detail. This is critical because the Temple Mount is the single most important piece of land in this entire conflict. And we'll keep coming back to it throughout this video. Now, the Jewish people lived in this land for centuries, but their history was not peaceful. In 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire invaded, destroyed Solomon's temple, and forced the Jewish people into exile. This was the first time the Jews were removed from their land, but it wouldn't be the last. They eventually returned and built a second temple. But then in 70 AD, the Roman Empire crushed a Jewish revolt and destroyed the second temple. The Romans killed over 1 million Jews, enslaved thousands more, and scattered the rest across the empire. The Romans were so determined to erase Jewish identity from the land that they renamed the entire region from Judea to Syria-Palestina. Now pay very close attention to that name, because it matters enormously. Syria-Palestina. The Romans chose that name deliberately. It was derived from the Philistines, an ancient enemy of the Jewish people, as a way to humiliate them and erase their connection to the land. And from that Roman name, Palestina, we eventually get the modern word Palestine. Now you're probably thinking, wait, so the name Palestine actually comes from the Romans? Yes, and this is one of the most important details in this entire conflict that most people have no idea about. But here's the thing. Just because the Romans renamed the land and expelled the Jews doesn't mean the Jews disappeared. They scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East in what historians call the Great Diaspora. For the next 1,900 years, the Jewish people lived as minorities in other people's countries, holding onto their identity, their religion, and their dream of one day returning to the land they believed God promised them. Every Passover for nearly 2,000 years, Jewish families around the world would end their meal with the same words, "Next year in Jerusalem." And that phrase wasn't just a prayer, it was a promise. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because while the Jews were scattered across the world dreaming of return, the land didn't sit empty. Other people moved in, lived there, built homes, raised families, and created their own deep connection to the land. And this is where the Arab and Muslim side of story begins. After the Romans, the land passed through the hands of several empires. The Byzantines controlled it for centuries, and then in 637 AD, something happened that changed the entire equation forever. Arab-Muslim armies conquered Jerusalem. And for Islam, Jerusalem was not just another conquered city. It was the third holiest site in their entire religion. Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem in a miraculous night journey called Al-Isra wal-Miraj. And from the exact same hilltop where Solomon's temple once stood, Muhammad ascended to heaven to speak with God. This is why the Dome of the Rock, that iconic golden-domed mosque, was built on top of the Temple Mount in 691 AD. And this is where you start to see the impossible not at the center of this conflict. The holiest site in Judaism and one of the holiest sites in Islam sit on the exact same hilltop. Jews believe this is where God's temple stood and must stand again. Muslims believe this is where Muhammad ascended to heaven. Two religions, one hilltop, and neither side will ever give it up. Historians call this the sacred knot, and no one in 3,000 years has figured out how to untie it. Now, after the Arab conquest, the land became predominantly Arab and Muslim over the following centuries. Arab families settled, built villages, planted olive groves, and created communities that lasted for generations. By the time the Ottoman Empire took control in the 1500s, the vast majority of people living on this land were Arab Muslims, along with smaller communities of Arab Christians and a tiny number of Jews who had never left. These Arab communities had been living on this land for over 1,000 years. They had their own culture, their own traditions, their own attachment to the land. And this is the Palestinian connection, not based on a covenant with God, but based on something equally powerful: centuries of continuous living on the land, generation after generation after generation. Now you're probably thinking, so both sides have a legitimate connection to this land? And that's exactly what makes this conflict so heartbreaking. Both sides are right, and both sides are wrong, and that's why it's been impossible to solve for 3,000 years. But the modern disaster, the one we see on our screens today, that started much more recently. And it started with one very specific event. To understand the modern conflict, we need to go to Europe in the late 1800s. For centuries, Jewish communities in Europe faced horrific persecution. They were forced into ghettos, banned from owning land, accused of bizarre conspiracies, massacred in events called pogroms, and treated as outsiders in every country they lived in. Historians call this pattern the cycle of persecution, and it followed the Jewish people everywhere they went for nearly 2,000 years. In Russia, mobs would attack Jewish neighborhoods, burning homes and killing families. In France, a Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus was falsely accused of treason simply because he was Jewish, and the entire country turned against him. A journalist named Theodor Herzl watched the Dreyfus trial in 1894 and had a realization that changed the course of history. He sat in that courtroom, listened to the crowds outside chanting, "Death to the Jews," and thought to himself, if this can happen in France, the most civilized country in Europe, then Jews will never be safe anywhere unless they have their own country. That thought became a movement called Zionism. The idea was simple but revolutionary. The Jewish people needed their own homeland, a place where they could govern themselves, protect themselves, and never again be at the mercy of someone else's government. And where would this homeland be? The only place that ever felt like home. The land their ancestors had been praying about for 2,000 years. The Promised Land, Palestine. Now here's where the collision course begins. In the late 1800s, Jewish immigrants began arriving in Palestine in waves that historians call the Aliyah. The first wave came in the 1880s. Small groups of idealistic young Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe who wanted to build a new life on the ancient land. They bought land from Ottoman and Arab landowners, set up farming communities, and started building what they hoped would become a Jewish homeland. But here's the critical detail that most people overlook. When these Jewish immigrants arrived, the land was not empty. Hundreds of thousands of Arab Palestinians were already living there. They had been living there for centuries. They had homes, farms, markets, mosques, churches, and communities. And suddenly, a growing number of foreigners were arriving, buying up land, and talking about building a Jewish state. Now you're probably thinking, didn't the Arabs notice what was happening? Of course they did. And tensions started rising almost immediately. Arab Palestinians looked at the growing Jewish immigration and felt threatened. These weren't just visitors. These were people with a plan to eventually create their own country on land that the Arabs considered theirs. But at this point, the numbers were still small, and the Ottoman Empire, which controlled the region, kept things relatively stable. That all changed with World War I. World War I destroyed the Ottoman Empire, and when the dust settled, Britain took control of Palestine through something called the British Mandate. And this is where Britain made what historians call the most dangerous promise in history. In 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a letter written by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour that stated Britain supported the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. One sentence. That's all it took. One sentence that promised a land that Britain did not own to a people who did not live there, without asking the people who already did. But here's the insane part. Britain didn't just promise the land to the Jews. During the war, Britain had also made promises to the Arabs. A British officer named T. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, had convinced Arab leaders to revolt against the Ottoman Empire by promising them independence and their own Arab state, which would include Palestine. So Britain promised the same land to two different groups of people at the same time. And this is the original sin of the modern conflict. One land, two promises, and both sides believed they had been told the truth. Under the British Mandate, Jewish immigration to Palestine accelerated dramatically. In the 1920s and 1930s, tens of thousands of Jews arrived, especially as anti-Semitism in Europe was getting worse. They built cities, infrastructure, hospitals, and universities. Tel Aviv, which today is a major global city, was founded in 1909 on sand dunes north of the ancient port of Jaffa. The Jewish community in Palestine grew stronger, more organized, and more determined to establish their state. Meanwhile, the Arab Palestinians watched all of this with growing fury. Their leaders protested to the British, saying, "You are giving away our homeland." The British tried to balance both sides and ended up pleasing no one. Tensions exploded into violence. In 1929, riots erupted across Palestine. Arabs attacked Jewish communities. Jews fought back, and the British stood in the middle trying to contain a fire they had started. Throughout the 1930s, the situation deteriorated further. The Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939 was a massive uprising by Palestinian Arabs against both the British and the growing Jewish presence. The British crushed the revolt with brutal force, destroying homes, imprisoning leaders, and killing thousands of Palestinians. But the underlying problem remained unsolved. Two peoples, one land, and no plan for how to share it. And then came the event that changed everything forever. Nothing in human history compares to what happened to the Jewish people during World War II. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime systematically murdered 6 million Jews in what we now call the Holocaust. 6 million men, women, and children killed in gas chambers, shot in mass graves, starved in concentration camps, worked to death in labor camps, and subjected to medical experiments that are too horrifying to describe. When the war ended in 1945 and the world saw the full scale of what had happened, the concentration camps, the skeletal survivors, the piles of bodies, everything changed. The Jewish people's argument for their own homeland went from a political idea to a moral imperative. The world looked at what had happened, and many people, especially in the West, came to the conclusion that the Jewish people needed a safe haven, a country of their own where something like the Holocaust could never happen again. Hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors had nowhere to go. Their homes in Europe had been destroyed, their families had been murdered, and no country wanted to take them in. Many of them boarded ships and headed for Palestine, the only place that felt like it could be home. The British, who were still controlling Palestine, tried to limit Jewish immigration and even turned away ships full of Holocaust survivors. The image of desperate refugees being turned away after surviving the worst genocide in history turned global opinion against Britain. The British, exhausted from the war and unable to solve the crisis, handed the problem to the newly formed United Nations. In November 1947, the United Nations voted on a plan to divide Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem as an international city controlled by neither side. Historians call this the Partition Plan. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan. They celebrated in the streets because for the first time in 2,000 years, the world was officially recognizing their right to a homeland. But the Arab side rejected it completely. And here's why. From the Arab perspective, the plan was fundamentally unjust. The Jewish population at the time made up about 1/3 of Palestine's people and owned less than 7% of the land. Yet the partition plan gave them 56% of the territory. The Arab Palestinians looked at this and said, "How can you give the majority of our land to a minority who just arrived? We've been here for centuries. This is our home. And you're asking us to accept being a minority in our own country? That was never going to happen." On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stood in a hall in Tel Aviv and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The Jewish people finally had their country. But within 24 hours, 5 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, declared war on the newborn state. And this is the moment the modern bloodshed truly began. Section 7, the Nakba and the Wars. Now you're probably thinking, what happened to the Palestinian Arabs when Israel was created? And this is the part of the story that is often left out of Western history books. What happened to the Palestinians in 1948 is something they call al-Nakba, which translates to the catastrophe, and it is the defining trauma of Palestinian identity. During the 1948 war, approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were expelled from or fled their homes. Entire villages were emptied. Families who had lived on their land for generations packed what they could carry and left, many believing they would return in a few weeks once the fighting stopped. They never returned. Some were forced out at gunpoint by Jewish militias. Others fled in terror after hearing about massacres in nearby villages. The most notorious was the Deir Yassin massacre in April 1948, where Jewish paramilitary groups attacked a Palestinian village near Jerusalem and killed over 100 men, women, and children. News of Deir Yassin spread like wildfire and caused mass panic across Palestine. Thousands of families fled, not because they wanted to, but because they were terrified of what would happen if they stayed. These 700,000 refugees ended up in overcrowded camps in neighboring countries: Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, and the Gaza Strip. They were told it would be temporary. It wasn't. Today, over 75 years later, there are approximately 5.9 million registered Palestinian refugees, the descendants of those original 700,000. Many still live in refugee camps. Many still carry the keys to the homes their grandparents left behind in 1948, and they have never been allowed to return. Israel, on the other hand, won the 1948 war, and expanded its territory beyond what the UN partition plan had originally granted. The new state absorbed hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants, many from the Middle East and North Africa, who were expelled from their own countries after Israel's creation. Israel built a modern nation at extraordinary speed, a democracy with a powerful military, a thriving economy, and a fierce determination to never again be destroyed. But the Palestinian problem didn't go away. It festered in those refugee camps like an infected wound, and every few years, it exploded into war. In 1967, Israel fought the Six-Day War against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and in just 6 days, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. It was one of the most stunning military victories in modern history, but it created a new crisis. Suddenly, Israel was occupying territories, with millions of Palestinian Arabs living in them. The question became, what do you do with these people? Do you give them citizenship? Do you give them independence? Do you keep them under military occupation? Israel chose occupation, and that occupation continues to this day. Now you might be wondering, what does occupation actually look like on the ground? And this is where the human cost of this conflict becomes impossible to ignore. In the West Bank, Israel built a network of military checkpoints that control Palestinian movement. A Palestinian who needs to travel from one city to another might have to pass through multiple checkpoints, waiting for hours, sometimes being turned away for no clear reason. Israel also began building settlements, Jewish communities on land that international law considers occupied Palestinian territory. These settlements started small in the 1970s, but today over 700,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The settlements are connected by roads that Palestinians are often not allowed to use. Palestinian homes are regularly demolished to make way for settlement expansion, and the Israeli military enforces the entire system. In Gaza, the situation is even more dire. After Israel withdrew its settlers from Gaza in 2005, the territory came under the control of Hamas, a militant group that calls for the destruction of Israel. Israel and Egypt imposed a blockade on Gaza, controlling everything that goes in and out: food, medicine, construction materials. Even the amount of electricity that enters Gaza is controlled by Israel. The United Nations has called Gaza the world's largest open-air prison. Nearly 2 million people live in a strip of land about 25 miles long and 7 miles wide. The poverty rate is above 50%. Unemployment is among the highest in the world. Clean water is scarce. And every few years, war erupts between Israel and Hamas, and civilians pay the price on both sides. Palestinians have resisted the occupation in many ways. The first Intifada in 1987 was a largely grassroots uprising where Palestinians threw stones at Israeli tanks, boycotted Israeli products, and organized strikes. The second Intifada in 2000 was far more violent, with suicide bombings targeting Israeli civilians in buses, restaurants, and shopping centers. Israel responded with massive military operations, targeted assassinations, and the construction of a separation wall that cuts deep into Palestinian territory. The cycle of violence has continued for decades. Israel says it needs to protect its citizens from terrorism. Palestinians say they are fighting against an illegal occupation that has stolen their land and crushed their dignity. Both sides point to their dead and say, "Look at what they did to us." And round it goes. Now you're probably thinking, hasn't anyone tried to make peace? Yes, many have tried, and every single attempt has failed. The closest the two sides ever came to peace was the Oslo Accords in 1993. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat shook hands on the White House lawn while President Bill Clinton stood between them smiling. The world thought it was over. That peace had finally come. But it hadn't. The Oslo process was supposed to lead to a Palestinian state within 5 years. It never happened. Settlements kept expanding, violence kept erupting, trust kept eroding. And then in 1995, a Jewish extremist assassinated Rabin at a peace rally in Tel Aviv. The man who was willing to trade land for peace was killed by one of his own people who believed the land was sacred and could never be given away. After Rabin's assassination, the peace process collapsed. The Second Intifada shattered whatever trust remained. The political landscape on both sides hardened. In Israel, leaders who favored security over compromise gained power. In Palestine, Hamas, which rejected peace with Israel entirely, won elections in Gaza. The two-state solution, which was supposed to give both peoples their own country living side by side, became a phrase that politicians repeated, but nobody believed in anymore. Every attempt at negotiation hits the same impossible walls. Jerusalem, both sides want it as their capital, and neither will give it up. Refugees, Palestinians demand the right to return to the homes they lost in 1948, and Israel says that would destroy the Jewish character of the state. Settlements, the international community says they're illegal, but Israel keeps building them. Borders, both sides disagree on where a Palestinian state would begin and end. And security, Israel says it can't trust a Palestinian state not to become a launching pad for attacks. These are not problems that can be solved with a handshake on a White House lawn. These are wounds that have been bleeding for 3,000 years, and every time someone tries to stitch them closed, something rips them open again. And here's the part that gets lost in the politics and the history and the arguments. Behind every statistic is a real human being. A Palestinian mother in Gaza who sends her children to school every morning, not knowing if they'll come home. An Israeli mother in Tel Aviv who holds her breath every time her son takes the bus. A Palestinian farmer who watches bulldozers demolish the olive trees his grandfather planted 60 years ago. An Israeli teenager who goes to a concert and never comes home. A Palestinian child who draws pictures of houses they've never seen because their grandparents told them stories about the home they lost in 1948. An Israeli child who grows up practicing rocket drills instead of fire drills. The numbers are staggering. Since 1948, tens of thousands of people on both sides have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been wounded. Millions have been displaced. Entire generations have grown up knowing nothing but conflict. Children on both sides are taught to fear and distrust the other before they're old enough to understand why. And the tragedy is that most of the people suffering on both sides want the exact same thing. They want to live in peace, raise their families, and feel safe in their own homes. But the machinery of conflict, the politicians, the extremists, the history, the trauma, it keeps grinding forward, crushing ordinary people beneath it. So why does Israel and Palestine fight? The answer is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is either lying or doesn't understand the full story. This is a conflict with roots that go back 3,000 years. A conflict where both sides have genuine historical connections to the same land, where both sides have suffered enormously, and where both sides have done things that are impossible to defend. It is a conflict fueled by religion, nationalism, colonialism, trauma, and the most basic human desire of all, the desire to have a home. The Jewish people spent 2,000 years scattered across the world, persecuted everywhere they went, dreaming of returning to the land they believed God promised them. They built a country from the ashes of the Holocaust and swore they would never be destroyed again. The Palestinian people lived on that same land for centuries, built their lives there, and then watched as their homes were taken, their villages erased, and their future stolen. They have spent 75 years as refugees, dreaming of returning to a home that no longer exists. Two peoples, one land, and a pain so deep that neither side can see past it. The world watches from the outside and picks sides as if this were a football match. But it's not a game. It's millions of real human lives trapped in a cycle of suffering that nobody knows how to break. And until the world stops choosing sides and starts choosing people, this 3,000-year-old wound will keep bleeding. The bombs will keep falling. The families will keep running. And the children on both sides will keep growing up in a world where peace is just a word that adults say, but never deliver. If this video helped you understand this conflict better, subscribe to Simply History. We tell the stories that shape the world, the stories that are too important to simplify and too urgent to ignore. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Share this with someone who needs to hear the full story, not the version they see in headlines. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.